The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, heavy enough to settle on the shoulders of everyone present. Charlotte Hale stood tall in the witness box, her gaze unwavering as she met the eyes of the man who had been trying to dismantle everything she had worked for. Jonathan Whitmore, the prosecution's star player. The courtroom itself was a grand, almost intimidating space, with high ceilings that carried every word spoken. Rows of dark wooden pews stretched behind her, filled with spectators, some curious, some judgmental, all waiting for the spectacle to unfold. The jury, a collection of mostly middle-aged white men and women, watched with mixed expressions, some skeptical, others passive. At the center of it all sat Judge Richard Calloway, a man whose presence alone commanded authority. He adjusted his glasses and rapped his gavel twice. His expression was unreadable, but his tone carried a tinge of impatience. "Let's keep this moving, counselor," Calloway instructed. Jonathan Whitmore, confident as ever, leaned forward. His suit was crisp, his smile rehearsed. "Mrs. Hale," he began, emphasizing the Mrs. in a way that made it sound condescending. "Are you aware that perjury is a federal offense?" The question was a dagger cloaked in silk. His words dripped with the kind of arrogance only a man convinced of his own power could possess. A few murmurs rippled through the jury box. Some of them nodded as if to say, "Yes, she must be lying." Charlotte inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She could feel the warmth of the spotlight on her skin, the scrutiny of every pair of eyes locked onto her. She didn't flinch. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice smooth but deliberate, "I suggest you choose your words carefully, because I am not just a witness." Before she could finish, the heavy double doors of the courtroom swung open with force. A sharply dressed man stormed in, his expression grave. The room, already thick with anticipation, fell completely silent. He made a beeline for Whitmore and Calloway, leaning in to whisper something urgent. For the first time, Whitmore's confidence flickered. Calloway, ever composed, straightened in his seat, but the slight shift in his expression did not go unnoticed. Something had changed. The air in the room was no longer just tense. It was electric. Everyone could feel it. The jury exchanged glances. The murmurs grew. Charlotte remained still, but inside her instincts were firing. Whatever had just happened, it was big. Bigger than Whitmore. Bigger than Calloway. And Charlotte felt a shift in control. "But before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you." 2 days earlier, the ringtone shattered the silence. It was late, too late for any good news. Charlotte Hale, still dressed from her long day at work, grabbed her phone from the nightstand. The caller ID read Jamal Hale. Relief flickered through her for a split second before she realized something was wrong. The voice on the other end wasn't her brother's. It was unfamiliar. "Is this Charlotte Hale?" The tone was clipped, impersonal. "Who is this?" she demanded, already reaching for her coat. "This is Officer Daniels, Atlanta PD. Your brother, Jamal Hale, has been arrested for assaulting a police officer. He's currently in custody at Fulton County Jail." For a moment, everything froze. Assaulting a police officer? That didn't make sense. Jamal wasn't violent. He wasn't reckless. He was the kind of man who avoided trouble at all costs. Charlotte swallowed her disbelief and forced her voice to remain steady. "I'm on my way." The drive to the precinct was a blur of headlights and half-formed thoughts. The streets of Atlanta, normally buzzing with life, felt unusually quiet. The weight of what awaited her settled like a heavy stone in her chest. When she stepped into the police station, the stifling air and fluorescent lights did little to ease her unease. The officer at the front desk barely glanced at her as she approached. "I'm here for Jamal Hale," she said firmly. The officer flipped through some paperwork. "He's in holding. No visitors until morning." Charlotte clenched her jaw. "I need to see him now." The officer finally looked up, eyes flickering with mild amusement. "That's not how it works, ma'am." She was about to argue when movement caught her eye. Through a small window down the hall, she spotted Jamal. His usually easygoing demeanor was gone. He sat stiffly on a metal bench, his head down. Even from a distance, she could see the bruise forming along his cheekbone. Her stomach twisted. "He's injured. Has he been seen by a doctor?" The officer shrugged. Didn't request medical attention. Charlotte took a slow breath, pushing down the anger rising in her throat. So, he was arrested for what exactly? The man behind the desk leaned back in his chair. Routine traffic stop. He refused to comply, then got aggressive. Things escalated. It was a lie. She could hear it in the practiced ease of his voice. Which officer arrested him? The man sighed, clearly growing irritated. Officer Holloway, you can wait until morning and speak to the DA if you've got concerns. That name, Holloway. It triggered something in the back of Charlotte's mind, but she couldn't place it. She tried again. I want to see the dash cam or body cam footage. This time the officer's expression shifted slightly. He hesitated before replying, that footage isn't available right now. That was all the confirmation she needed. They were hiding something. She turned on her heel and walked out of the station, but not before catching one last glimpse of Jamal. He lifted his head just for a moment, his eyes locking onto hers. It was brief, but in that instant, she read everything in his expression. Fear, confusion, betrayal. Outside, the humid Georgia air did little to ease the tightness in her chest. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in a long time. Marcus, she said when he answered. I need your help. Marcus Reed, one of the best defense attorneys she knew, and one of the few people she still trusted in this city. What's going on? His voice was already alert. Jamal's been set up, she said, scanning the street as if expecting someone to be watching her. And I need to prove it before it's too late. As she hung up, her eyes drifted back to the station. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in her bones, and she was going to find out exactly what they were hiding. Charlotte wasn't the type to back down. She never had been. By morning, she was parked outside the Fulton County Courthouse, gripping a steaming cup of coffee as she scrolled through her contacts. She had spent most of the night making calls, pulling every string she could. Her time in the Secret Service had left her with connections, some active, some buried, but all useful when needed. Jamal's arrest wasn't just bad luck. It was orchestrated, and she was going to prove it. Inside the courthouse, Marcus Reed was already waiting for her. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe just carrying the weight of too many cases lost to a system rigged against men like him. His suit was sharp, but there was exhaustion in his eyes, the kind that never really went away. I pulled the police report, Marcus said, handing her a thin manila folder as they walked toward the legal records office. And you're not going to like what you see. Charlotte flipped it open, her fingers tightening around the edges of the paper. The arrest report, signed by Officer James Holloway, was riddled with inconsistencies. The body cam footage? She asked. Conveniently unavailable, Marcus said dryly. According to the department, the camera malfunctioned right before the stop and didn't start recording again until after Jamal was in cuffs. Charlotte exhaled through her nose, forcing herself to stay calm. That was lie number one. Dash cam? Marcus shook his head. The cruiser assigned to Holloway had its system under maintenance that night. Lie number two. Charlotte flipped to the next page, where the report detailed what supposedly happened. It claimed Jamal had been pulled over for a broken taillight. He had become aggressive, refused to comply, and lunged at the officer. That's when Holloway had been forced to restrain him. None of it made sense. Jamal wasn't confrontational, he wasn't reckless. He was calculated in every move he made, especially when it came to dealing with law enforcement. Tell me we have witnesses, Charlotte said. Marcus hesitated. Yes, so and no. There was a woman across the street, saw everything, but she refused to sign a statement. Charlotte frowned. Why? Marcus lowered his voice. She's scared. Said she doesn't want any trouble. Charlotte closed the folder and clenched her jaw. She had seen this too many times before. Witnesses intimidated into silence. Evidence conveniently misplaced. A system designed to protect itself at all costs. We need to find her, Charlotte said. If she saw what happened, she might have recorded something. Before Marcus could respond, a familiar voice cut through the hallway. Mrs. Hale? Charlotte turned to see Jonathan Whitmore striding toward them, his confidence infuriatingly intact. Enjoying your morning? He asked smoothly. Charlotte didn't smile. What do you want, Whitmore? He folded his arms, smirking just enough to make her want to punch him. I heard you've been asking a lot of questions, pulling some favors, digging around where you shouldn't. Charlotte kept her expression unreadable. Whitmore leaned in just slightly, lowering his voice. I get it. Family makes us do desperate things. But let me give you some free advice. This case, it's a lost cause. Your brother had his chance. He made his choice. Charlotte stared at him, her pulse steady. You really believe that? She asked, tilting her head slightly. Whitmore's smirk widened. It doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what the jury believes. And trust me, they'll believe what I tell them. Charlotte exhaled slowly. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to react. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she leaned in, just enough for her words to be clear. Jonathan, you've spent your career thinking people like me don't fight back, that we just accept what happens to us. But let me tell you something. You are dead wrong. Whitmore's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Then just as quickly it returned. He straightened his tie and gave her a mockingly sympathetic look. Good luck, Mrs. Hale, he said. You'll need it. He walked away, leaving behind the stench of arrogance. Marcus let out a breath. Well, that went well. Charlotte didn't respond. Her mind was already racing ahead. She had spent years navigating systems built to suppress people like her, watching how power moved in rooms like this. She wasn't just going to fight back. She was going to burn it all down. Her phone buzzed. A blocked number. She answered. A male voice, distorted and low, came through the speaker. They've done this before, the caller said, and if you keep pushing, you'll regret it. Charlotte didn't flinch. Then I guess we're about to find out, aren't we? The line went dead. She lowered the phone, glancing at Marcus. They're scared, she said simply. He raised an eyebrow. How do you know? Charlotte slipped the folder under her arm. Because if they weren't, she said, they wouldn't be calling. Charlotte had spent years learning how to work within the system, how to navigate the bureaucracy, the red tape, the endless politics of power. But now, standing in the dim glow of her laptop screen, she realized something else. Sometimes you had to know when to break the system. She tapped a few keys, bypassing the usual requests and logging directly into a secure database. The perks of once being a Secret Service agent weren't just the badge and the title, it was access. The security footage from the traffic cameras near the location of Jamal's arrest should have been public record. Instead, she found a single line of text flashing in red. Restricted access, Charlotte muttered under her breath. Someone had locked it down. That wasn't normal. Even in controversial cases, street footage was rarely restricted this fast. It meant someone had gotten ahead of her. She glanced at her phone, debating her next move. If the city wouldn't give her the footage through official channels, she needed another way in. That was when she remembered Emily Carter. The journalist was known for getting her hands on things others couldn't. She had a way of talking to people, of finding the cracks in stories before they had a chance to harden into official versions. Charlotte dialed the number. It rang twice before Emily's voice came through, calm but alert. Didn't expect to hear from you so soon. I need footage, Charlotte said bluntly, from the night of Jamal's arrest. There was a pause, the sound of typing in the background. You're not the only one looking for it. Charlotte's grip on the phone tightened. Who else? Emily hesitated. Let's just say it's not people who want the truth coming out. Charlotte exhaled. Can you get it? Another beat of silence. Then, meet me in 20 minutes. Bring coffee. Charlotte was already grabbing her keys. The small diner Emily had chosen was nearly empty, save for a few late-night regulars hunched over their plates. The air smelled of burnt coffee and bacon grease. Emily was seated in the corner, laptop open, fingers tapping a steady rhythm on the table. She didn't look up as Charlotte slid into the seat across from her. Tell me what you have, Charlotte said. Emily turned the screen toward her. This is from a witness. They recorded the arrest from across the street. The video was shaky, the angle slightly obscured by a parked car, but the scene was unmistakable. Jamal being pulled from his vehicle, hands already raised. The officers didn't hesitate. One of them shoved him against the hood. Another yanked his arms behind his back with unnecessary force. Then came the part that made Charlotte's stomach twist. Jamal didn't resist. He didn't fight back. And yet, Holloway struck him across the face. The force of the blow sent Jamal stumbling, his head snapping to the side. Blood splattered onto the pavement. Charlotte pressed her lips together, rage simmering beneath her skin. "They said he attacked them first," she said quietly. Emily leaned back, folding her arms. "I know." Charlotte exhaled slowly. "We need to get this to the court." Emily didn't respond right away. Instead, she clicked another file. "Wait," she said. A second video played. Different angle, different phone. The realization hit Charlotte instantly. "There's more than one witness." Emily nodded. "And this one?" They were standing close enough to record the audio. Charlotte's eyes flickered to the screen as the video continued. She heard the impact first, the unmistakable crack of knuckles against flesh. Then a voice, low, mocking. "You think your sister's gonna save you?" Charlotte went still. She recognized that voice. It was Holloway. Emily let the video run for another few seconds before pausing it. "You understand why I can't release this yet," she said. "If I do, it disappears. They'll claim it was doctored. They'll discredit the source. We need the right moment." Charlotte clenched her jaw. "And what if they find the witness before we can use it?" Emily didn't answer, but she didn't have to. Charlotte's next stop was the courthouse. She had no intention of letting this evidence sit in the dark, but she wasn't the only one who had made that decision. The moment she stepped inside, she saw Jonathan Whitmore waiting for her, his posture as casual as ever. But his eyes? They held something colder now. "You're making this difficult, Charlotte," he said smoothly. Charlotte kept walking, but he stepped in front of her, lowering his voice. "I heard about the video." Of course he had. "You're not going to win this," he continued, his confidence unwavering. "You think a couple of grainy videos are going to change anything? You need more than that." Charlotte looked him in the eye. "We have audio," she said. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his expression. Just a flicker, but it was enough. Whitmore took a step closer, voice dropping even further. "You don't understand how this works, do you? You're not fighting one man. You're fighting an entire system, and systems don't fall because one person decides they should." Charlotte held his gaze. "Neither do dictators," she said, "until they do." Whitmore's jaw tightened, but he forced a smirk. "Good luck with that." He turned to walk away. Charlotte let him go, for now. Her phone buzzed, a blocked number. She answered, already expecting another threat. Instead, it was something else, a voice nervous, hushed. "I can't say much," the caller whispered, "but someone wants this case gone. Fast." Charlotte's breath slowed. "Who?" A pause, then, "You already know." The line went dead, and Charlotte realized this wasn't just about Jamal anymore. This was bigger, much bigger. Marcus Reed was already waiting when Charlotte arrived at his office. The dim lighting cast long shadows on the mahogany desk, the faint scent of stale coffee hanging in the air. Stacks of legal briefs and case files were scattered across the room, each one a battle fought or lost against a system that rarely bent in favor of people like Jamal. Charlotte sat down without preamble, crossing her arms. "Tell me where we stand." Marcus exhaled, rubbing his temple before flipping open a case file. "Not good," he admitted. "Jamal is still being held without bail." Whitmore filed a motion to expedite the trial. "He's pushing to have the case wrapped up in record time." Charlotte's stomach tightened. "He's trying to kill this before we can expose what's really going on." "Exactly," Marcus said, tapping his pen against the file. "And here's the kicker. Judge Calloway is presiding. You remember his reputation?" Charlotte let out a sharp breath. She knew it well. Calloway had a long history of siding with prosecutors in cases like this. He wasn't just biased, he was calculated. There had been whispers for years about his rulings favoring law enforcement, but nothing had ever stuck. He was untouchable. She leaned forward. "What about our evidence? Can we get the video into discovery before they shut it down?" Marcus hesitated. "In theory, yes. But we both know Calloway can suppress it if he decides it's inadmissible. And with Whitmore breathing down his neck, I'd bet he'll do exactly that." Charlotte's grip on the chair tightened. They were being boxed in from every angle. Every move she made, the system moved faster. Then her phone buzzed, a blocked number. She hesitated, then answered. "I don't have much time," a voice whispered. It was the same one from before. the mysterious caller who had warned her. Charlotte's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" "Someone who knows what you're up against," the man said. "Meet me at Belmont Cafe. Midnight. Come alone." The line went dead. Charlotte lowered the phone slowly. Marcus studied her face. "What now?" She met his eyes. "I think we just got our first real lead." The Belmont Cafe was the kind of place that looked forgotten. A 24-hour diner with flickering neon signs, cracked leather booths, and a jukebox that hadn't worked in decades. Charlotte arrived early, slipping into a booth near the back, her eyes scanning the room. She wasn't alone. Emily Carter sat across from her, recording device hidden beneath the menu. "I don't like this," Emily muttered, stirring her coffee. "It smells like a setup." Charlotte smirked. "That's why I brought you." A few minutes later, a man slid into the seat beside them. He wore a worn-out baseball cap pulled low, sunglasses even though it was nearly midnight. His shoulders were hunched, and he kept glancing at the door. "You got guts showing up," he murmured. Charlotte folded her hands on the table. "You called me?" The man exhaled, tapping his fingers nervously against the tabletop. "They know what you're doing. They're watching." Charlotte didn't flinch. "Who?" The man hesitated. "Bigger than just Whitmore. The jury's been compromised. Some of them have already been persuaded." Emily leaned in. "Persuaded how?" "Threats, promises, money," the man listed off quietly. "They don't need the truth to come out. They need this case closed. Fast." Charlotte clenched her jaw. "And what about the evidence?" The man hesitated again, then reached into his jacket. He slid a small USB drive across the table. "This," he said, "is the original police report. The unedited version. They scrubbed it from the official system, but I got to it before they erased everything." Charlotte picked up the drive carefully. "What's on it?" "The real story," the man said. "Jamal never resisted. Holloway escalated the situation. And there's one more thing." Charlotte waited. The man's eyes flickered toward the door. "There was a second officer there that night, one who never appeared in the final report." Charlotte's stomach turned. "Who?" The man swallowed hard. "I don't know his name, but he wasn't just some beat cop. He was there to make sure everything went the way it was supposed to." Emily scribbled notes furiously. "And you think this guy's connected to something bigger?" The man nodded. "I don't think. I know." Before Charlotte could press for more, the man glanced at his watch and abruptly stood. "I need to go," he said. "If I stay any longer, they'll know I talked." Charlotte reached out, but he pulled away. "Be careful," he warned. "You're playing a dangerous game." Then just like that, he was gone. Emily let out a slow breath. "Well, that was ominous." Charlotte pocketed the USB drive. "We need to get this analyzed." Emily raised an eyebrow. "You think it's legit?" Charlotte's expression hardened. "We'll find out." They were halfway back to Charlotte's apartment when she noticed the car. Black sedan, no plates. It had been behind them for at least 6 blocks. Emily must have noticed too because her grip on the steering wheel tightened. "We've got company." Charlotte didn't panic. Instead, she calmly reached for her phone and pulled up her GPS. "Take the next right," she said. Emily obeyed, but the car followed. Charlotte's mind worked fast. If this was just a scare tactic, they'd keep their distance. If it was something worse, "Turn again," she said. Emily took another sharp turn. The car stayed with them. Charlotte exhaled. "All right, let's lose them." Emily floored the gas, weaving through the late-night traffic. The black sedan kept up. Charlotte counted the seconds, waiting for the right moment. Then, "Now!" Emily swerved into an alley, killed the headlights, and pulled in tight behind a delivery truck. The sedan sped past, unaware they had disappeared. They sat in silence, waiting. After a long minute, Emily finally spoke. "That was fun." Charlotte wasn't smiling. "They're not just watching anymore," she murmured. Emily turned to her. "So what does that mean?" Charlotte looked out into the empty street. "It means we're getting close." Her phone buzzed. Another unknown number. She answered. A familiar voice, low and cold. "Mrs. Hale," the caller said. "You should have walked away." Then the line went dead. Charlotte stared at the screen, the weight of the words settling over her. She wasn't just up against a corrupt system. She was up against people who would do anything to keep their power intact. And now they knew she wasn't backing down. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and old paper, a place where laws were written in ink but enforced with quiet corruption. Charlotte walked beside Marcus Reed, her heels clicking against the marble floors as they approached Judge Calloway's chambers. The walls here were lined with portraits of past judges, men who had held power like a gavel, wielding justice as they saw fit. Marcus exhaled beside her. "You really think he'll even listen?" Charlotte didn't answer. She knew the odds, but she wasn't here to ask for permission. The door to Calloway's office was slightly ajar, his voice carrying through the crack. "Don't want this dragging on longer than necessary." Charlotte pushed the door open. Calloway barely looked up from his paperwork. He was an older man, his graying hair combed back neatly, his hands folded on the desk like he'd been expecting them. Beside him, a heavy-set clerk glanced between them with measured disinterest. "You're not scheduled," Calloway said, finally meeting Charlotte's gaze. "We have new evidence," she said, setting a USB drive on the desk. The judge didn't move. "The deadline for submitting evidence has passed." Marcus leaned forward. "Your Honor, this evidence proves—" "I know what it proves," Calloway cut in smoothly, "and I know what you think you're doing. But the law has procedures, deadlines, protocols. You don't get to break the rules just because you don't like how things are playing out." Charlotte's jaw tightened. "You're protecting them." Calloway's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked amused. "I'm following the law." "You're bending it," she shot back. Calloway leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Hale, I understand your frustration. I truly do. But this is how the system works. It may not be perfect, but it's what we have." Charlotte took a step closer. "And what happens when that system is built to protect the people who abuse it?" Calloway's jaw tensed slightly, a flicker of annoyance beneath his polished demeanor. "You're trying to fight a war you don't understand," he said. "You don't change the system by kicking and screaming. You change it from within." Charlotte's voice was steady. "And what if the people within it don't want it to change?" A pause. Then Calloway sighed, shaking his head. "I hope you find peace with this case, Mrs. Hale. I truly do." And with that, he gestured toward the door. Marcus muttered a curse under his breath as they walked out. Once the door shut behind them, he turned to Charlotte. "Now what?" Charlotte's mind was already working. The system had shut the door on them. That meant they had to find another way in. She pulled out her phone. "We go public." Emily's apartment was cluttered with stacks of notebooks, half-filled coffee mugs, and the unmistakable hum of a newsroom in miniature. The journalist paced as Charlotte and Marcus sat at her kitchen table, the USB drive between them. "You want to leak this?" Emily asked. Charlotte nodded. "Mainstream media won't touch it, but independent sources will. We need eyes on this before they bury it for good." Emily folded her arms. "You do realize what happens when this airs, right? If you put this out there, you're officially making enemies out of powerful people." Charlotte met her gaze. "I think we've already done that." Emily hesitated for only a moment before picking up her phone. "I know a guy." That night, Charlotte sat on the edge of her couch, staring at the muted TV screen. A small independent news station, one of the few still willing to take risks, had agreed to air the footage. At exactly 10:03 p.m., it began. The video played. Jamal, the stop, the fabricated aggression, the assault. It was out there now, raw and undeniable. Her phone buzzed with notifications, messages, missed calls, emails from journalists and lawyers who had just seen what she had seen. Then as the segment ended, the anchor's expression shifted. "This just in," she said. "Reports are coming in that Jamal Hale, the man at the center of this controversial case, has been hospitalized after an incident inside Fulton County Jail." Charlotte's breath caught. The screen changed to a breaking news banner, the words clear and brutal. "Jamal Hale assaulted in custody. Condition critical." She barely heard Marcus cursing beside her. The room felt distant, the edges of reality pulling away. Her hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just about evidence anymore. This was personal. Charlotte gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The city lights blurred past as she sped toward the prison hospital, her mind racing. The news report had been vague, just enough information to stoke public outrage, but not enough to expose the truth. Jamal had been attacked. She didn't know how bad it was. She didn't know if he was even conscious. All she knew was that they had sent a message. By the time she reached the entrance, Marcus was already waiting for her. He looked tense, phone in hand, pacing near the doors. The air smelled of disinfectant and rain, the pavement still wet from a late-night drizzle. "What do you know?" she demanded as soon as she stepped out of the car. Marcus exhaled sharply. "They're saying it was a fight between inmates, that Jamal was involved in an altercation." Charlotte's stomach twisted. "And the truth?" Marcus hesitated before lowering his voice. "A guard told me off the record. Jamal didn't start anything. He was jumped. Someone wanted to teach him a lesson." Charlotte felt the heat rise in her chest. "Who?" Marcus shook his head. "No names. But let's be real. This wasn't random." Charlotte clenched her jaw and stormed toward the entrance, pushing past the guard at the front desk. "I need to see my brother," she said, her voice sharp. The officer barely glanced up. "Visiting hours are over." "I don't care," Charlotte snapped. "You're either going to let me in, or I'll make sure this place is flooded with reporters in the next 10 minutes. That got his attention. He sighed, picking up the phone. After a hushed conversation, he gestured for her to follow. Through the sterile white corridors, past the locked doors and security checkpoints, they finally reached a small room with a single bed. Jamal lay there, bandaged, his face swollen, a cut along his brow still fresh. His eyes were closed, his breathing steady but shallow. Charlotte sat beside him, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. She reached for his hand. His fingers twitched. Slowly, his eyelids fluttered open. "Hey," she said softly. Jamal tried to smile, but it barely formed. "You look mad," he muttered. Charlotte let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sigh of frustration. "I am." Jamal swallowed. "They told me to stop talking. Said you needed to back off." Charlotte's grip on his hand tightened. That was it. This wasn't just about silencing Jamal. It was about controlling her. The door creaked open behind her. She turned to see Jonathan Whitmore standing in the doorway, his expression infuriatingly composed. "I heard about what happened," he said, stepping inside. "Terrible thing." Charlotte stood up slowly. "Cut the act, Whitmore." He tilted his head, almost amused. "I'm just saying, this is a prison. Things happen." Charlotte's nails dug into her palm. "You're threatening him." Whitmore's smirk never faltered. "I'm stating facts. If your brother stays quiet, he stays safe. If not," he shrugged. "Who knows?" Charlotte felt her pulse hammering, but she forced herself to stay calm. "You really think this is going to scare me?" Whitmore exhaled as if he were bored. "Charlotte, let's be honest. You're smart enough to know how this works. You push too hard and people get hurt. Walk away now, and your brother gets to live his life." Charlotte stared at him, rage boiling in her chest. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Whitmore seemed to sense it. He sighed and stepped back toward the door. "Suit yourself. Just remember, you were warned." With that, he was gone. Silence filled the room. Jamal shifted slightly in the bed. "Charlotte, don't do anything stupid." Charlotte forced a smile. "Me? Never." But she was already planning. She needed a new approach, one they wouldn't see coming. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A blocked number. She answered. That night, Charlotte sat on the edge of her couch, staring at the muted TV screen. A small independent news station, one of the few still willing to take risks, had agreed to air the footage. At exactly 10:03 p.m., it began. The video played. Jamal, the stop, the fabricated aggression, the assault. It was out there now, raw and undeniable. Her phone buzzed with notifications, messages, missed calls, emails from journalists and lawyers who had just seen what she had seen. Then as the segment ended, the anchor's expression shifted. "This just in," she said. "Reports are coming in that Jamal Hale, the man at the center of this controversial case, has been hospitalized after an incident inside Fulton County Jail." Charlotte's breath caught. The screen changed to a breaking news banner, the words clear and brutal. Jamal Hale assaulted in custody. Condition critical. She barely heard Marcus cursing beside her. The room felt distant, the edges of reality pulling away. Her hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just about evidence anymore. This was personal. Charlotte gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The city lights blurred past as she sped toward the prison hospital, her mind racing. The news report had been vague, just enough information to stoke public outrage, but not enough to expose the truth. Jamal had been attacked. She didn't know how bad it was. She didn't know if he was even conscious. All she knew was that they had sent a message. By the time she reached the entrance, Marcus was already waiting for her. He looked tense, phone in hand, pacing near the doors. The air smelled of disinfectant and rain, the pavement still wet from a late-night drizzle. "What do you know?" she demanded as soon as she stepped out of the car. Marcus exhaled sharply. "They're saying it was a fight between inmates, that Jamal was involved in an altercation." Charlotte's stomach twisted. "And the truth?" Marcus hesitated before lowering his voice. "A guard told me off the record. Jamal didn't start anything. He was jumped. Someone wanted to teach him a lesson." Charlotte felt the heat rise in her chest. "Who?" Marcus shook his head. "No names. But let's be real. This wasn't random." Charlotte clenched her jaw and stormed toward the entrance, pushing past the guard at the front desk. "I need to see my brother," she said, her voice sharp. The officer barely glanced up. "Visiting hours are over." "I don't care," Charlotte snapped. "You're either going to let me in, or I'll make sure this place is flooded with reporters in the next 10 minutes. That got his attention. He sighed, picking up the phone. After a hushed conversation, he gestured for her to follow. Through the sterile white corridors, past the locked doors and security checkpoints, they finally reached a small room with a single bed. Jamal lay there, bandaged, his face swollen, a cut along his brow still fresh. His eyes were closed, his breathing steady but shallow. Charlotte sat beside him, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. She reached for his hand. His fingers twitched. Slowly, his eyelids fluttered open. "Hey," she said softly. Jamal tried to smile, but it barely formed. "You look mad," he muttered. Charlotte let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sigh of frustration. "I am." Jamal swallowed. "They told me to stop talking. Said you needed to back off." Charlotte's grip on his hand tightened. That was it. This wasn't just about silencing Jamal. It was about controlling her. The door creaked open behind her. She turned to see Jonathan Whitmore standing in the doorway, his expression infuriatingly composed. "I heard about what happened," he said, stepping inside. "Terrible thing." Charlotte stood up slowly. "Cut the act, Whitmore." He tilted his head, almost amused. "I'm just saying, this is a prison. Things happen." Charlotte's nails dug into her palm. "You're threatening him." Whitmore's smirk never faltered. "I'm stating facts. If your brother stays quiet, he stays safe. If not," he shrugged. "Who knows?" Charlotte felt her pulse hammering, but she forced herself to stay calm. "You really think this is going to scare me?" Whitmore exhaled as if he were bored. "Charlotte, let's be honest. You're smart enough to know how this works. You push too hard and people get hurt. Walk away now, and your brother gets to live his life." Charlotte stared at him, rage boiling in her chest. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Whitmore seemed to sense it. He sighed and stepped back toward the door. "Suit yourself. Just remember, you were warned." With that, he was gone. Silence filled the room. Jamal shifted slightly in the bed. "Charlotte, don't do anything stupid." Charlotte forced a smile. "Me? Never." But she was already planning. She needed a new approach, one they wouldn't see coming. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A blocked number. She answered. This wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about surviving it. Dawson stood, tucking his hands into his coat pockets. "Take my advice, Hale. Use that file carefully. You're up against people who don't play fair." Charlotte tucked the folder inside her jacket. "Neither do I." Dawson studied her for a long moment, then gave a small, approving nod. "Good luck," he muttered before disappearing into the shadows. Charlotte sat there for a long time, the night air pressing against her skin, the weight of what she had just learned sinking in. Then slowly, she pulled out the last page of the file, the one with the name she hadn't expected to see, a name tied directly to the Department of Justice. She stared at it, her pulse steady. Then she reached for her phone. It was time to go to war. Charlotte locked the door behind her, the click of the deadbolt echoing in the silence of her apartment. The air inside was still, carrying the faint scent of coffee and books, a small refuge from the storm she had willingly stepped into. She set the manila folder on the kitchen counter, her fingers resting on the worn edges. For a long moment, she just stared at it. Dawson had warned her. This wasn't just about a few bad cops. This was about an entire system built to protect itself at any cost. She exhaled, then flipped the folder open. The first few pages were familiar. Arrest reports, statements from officers, documents that had all been manipulated to fit a narrative. But as she dug deeper, the real picture started to emerge. This wasn't just about Jamal. There were names, dozens of them. Young black men and women, all charged with crimes that followed the same pattern. Routine stops, exaggerated charges, lost evidence, suppressed testimonies. And one by one, their cases had been sealed, dismissed, or conveniently forgotten. Some of them had never made it home. Charlotte swallowed hard as she turned to a list of names marked with red ink. A few were listed as deceased, causes of death ranging from accidental overdose to suicide in custody. But the further she read, the harder it became to ignore the pattern. One name stood out among the rest: Alan Foster, the last known witness in a case eerily similar to Jamal's. A man who had agreed to testify against officers in a police brutality trial before he was found dead in his jail cell, officially ruled as self-inflicted. Charlotte clenched her jaw. Buried beneath the official reports, a memo caught her attention. The header bore the insignia of the Department of Justice, and at the bottom of the page was a signature she recognized immediately: Deputy Attorney General Matthew Kane. Charlotte's breath slowed. Kane wasn't just some bureaucrat. He was one of the most powerful figures in federal law enforcement. If his name was on these documents, it meant this operation wasn't just local, it was protected at the highest levels of government. She snapped the folder shut, her pulse pounding. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. And then, she noticed something. Her laptop, usually resting neatly on her desk, was slightly ajar. A cold sensation crept up her spine. She stood up slowly, her gaze sweeping the apartment. The papers she had left stacked on her coffee table were scattered across the floor. Someone had been here. She grabbed her phone and opened her security app. The feed from her apartment's camera was blank, files corrupted. Her hands curled into fists as she stepped toward the counter. That's when she saw it, a single slip of paper placed neatly in the center of the table. 3 words: "Walk away now." Charlotte's chest rose and fell in measured breaths. She reached for her phone and dialed. Emily Carter answered on the second ring. "Tell me you have good news," the journalist said, her voice groggy. Charlotte barely heard her. "My place was hit." Emily immediately woke up. "What?" "Someone got in while I was gone. They wrecked my files, took my hard drive, left a message." Emily cursed. "Are you okay?" Charlotte exhaled through her nose. "They want me to back off." There was silence for a beat. Then Emily said, "So what's the plan?" Charlotte looked at the folder again, at the name Matthew Kane staring back at her. "We go public," she said. Emily let out a slow breath. "That's a big move. You sure?" Charlotte tightened her grip on the phone. "They wouldn't be trying this hard to scare me if I wasn't onto something real." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then her voice steadied. "All right, but we need more than just documents. We need someone who can confirm this on record." Charlotte pinched the bridge of her nose. "Dawson won't go public." "Then we find someone else." Charlotte opened her mouth to argue, but at that moment, her phone vibrated with an incoming call. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A man's voice, low and urgent, came through the line. "Mrs. Hale, I have information, but I won't talk on the phone." Charlotte's pulse quickened. "Who is this?" A pause, then, "Meet me at the Grandview Hotel, 15th floor, 2 a.m. The line went dead. Charlotte stared at the screen, her heart hammering. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Charlotte parked a block away from the Grandview Hotel, shutting off her headlights before stepping out. The city was quiet at this hour, the streets emptied except for the occasional cab or late-night straggler. A damp chill clung to the air, the pavement still slick from an earlier drizzle. She pulled her coat tighter around her and scanned her surroundings. The hotel was an old, towering structure with an elegance that had faded over time. The neon sign flickered weakly above the entrance. She was early, 7 minutes to 2. Her instincts told her this was dangerous. A meeting like this, at this hour, was a calculated risk. But the voice on the phone had been desperate, urgent. Whoever he was, he had something she needed. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, the desk clerk barely glancing up as she walked past. She took the elevator up to the 15th floor, her fingers hovering near her pocket where she kept a small folding knife. Not much against a gun, but better than nothing. The hallway was empty, lined with faded carpet and peeling wallpaper. Room 1507 was at the far end. Charlotte knocked once. The door opened just enough for a man to peek out, eyes darting left and right before he yanked her inside. He was thin, mid-40s, wearing a wrinkled dress shirt with sweat stains forming under the collar. His hands shook slightly as he locked the door behind them. "You came alone?" he asked. Charlotte nodded, studying him. "Who are you?" He swallowed. "My name doesn't matter. What I know does." "Then start talking." The man paced, rubbing the back of his neck. "I worked on internal investigations for the DOJ," he said. "I handled sensitive cases, complaints against law enforcement, allegations of corruption. Most of them never went anywhere. Not because they weren't real, but because they weren't allowed to go anywhere." Charlotte felt a familiar rage rise in her chest, but she stayed quiet, letting him continue. "The system is rigged," he went on. "Prosecutors like Whitmore don't work alone. Judges like Calloway, they're just one piece. The real control happens higher up, people with enough power to make sure no one asks the wrong questions." "And you?" Charlotte asked. "Where do you fit in?" His eyes flickered with guilt. "I filed reports, sent complaints up the chain. I thought I was doing the right thing, until I realized my reports were never going anywhere. They were being buried, and the people who spoke up, they disappeared. Some lost their jobs. Some—" He trailed off, rubbing his face. "Some ended up dead," Charlotte finished for him. He nodded, throat tightening. "They don't just silence cases. They erase them." She exhaled slowly. "So why now? Why come forward?" He hesitated, then opened a desk drawer, pulling out a USB drive. "Because this is the first real proof I've ever had." Charlotte took the drive, turning it over in her fingers. "What's on it?" "Documents, emails, case files that were supposed to be deleted. It's all connected. The judges, the prosecutors, the cops. They control outcomes before cases even reach the courtroom." Charlotte's pulse quickened. "And Kane?" The man's jaw clenched. "He's not just involved. He's the one holding the strings." Before she could respond, the room plunged into darkness. The power cut out. For a split second, there was only silence. Thick, suffocating. Then the door burst open. Two figures in black masks stormed in. Charlotte barely had time to react before the first attacker lunged. She moved on instinct, dodging as the man swung at her. She countered, jabbing her elbow into his ribs before shoving him back. The second man went straight for the informant. "Run!" Charlotte yelled, but it was too late. A gunshot shattered the silence. The informant collapsed, clutching his stomach, gasping for air. Charlotte's vision tunneled. The first attacker swung again, but she ducked low, sweeping his legs out from under him. He hit the ground hard, but the second man was already retreating. She barely caught a glimpse of him before he vanished down the hall. By the time she turned back, the informant was struggling for breath, blood pooling beneath him. She knelt beside him, pressing down on the wound. "Stay with me." His hand trembled as he grabbed her wrist. His lips moved barely above a whisper. "They have someone inside," he rasped. Charlotte's stomach dropped. "Inside where?" His grip tightened, eyes clouding over. "Inside your system." His body shuddered once. Then he was still. Charlotte sat frozen for a moment, the words echoing in her head. Someone inside her system. Not just the DOJ, not just the courts, someone close to her. Her pulse pounded as she reached for the USB drive, still clutched in her hand. She had the proof now, but she also had a target on her back. Charlotte stepped out of the Grandview Hotel into the cold night air, her heart still hammering against her ribs. The streets were nearly empty, the distant hum of the city feeling like a world away from the chaos that had just unfolded in room 1507. She wiped her palm against her coat, realizing too late that it was slick with blood. Not hers, but his. The informant. The only man willing to break the silence had died in front of her, leaving behind a warning that now echoed in her head. They have someone inside your system. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to push past the panic creeping up her spine. The implications of those words cut deeper than anything else. Someone she trusted was feeding information to the people trying to bury this case. Someone close. She had to figure out who. Sliding into her car, she locked the doors and pulled out her phone. The USB drive from the informant sat in the passenger seat, a ticking time bomb of evidence. It wasn't safe here. Nothing was. She needed to think, and she needed to find the leak before they got to her first. Back at her apartment, Charlotte sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open, the USB drive plugged in. She hadn't turned on the lights, relying on the glow of the screen to keep her hidden from any eyes that might be watching. The documents were extensive: emails, case files, lists of altered evidence. But one thing caught her attention immediately: a spreadsheet, names, case numbers, financial transactions, a ledger of people who had either cooperated with Whitmore and Calloway or had been silenced. And at the bottom, payments to an anonymous account made just days before Jamal's arrest. Charlotte's stomach twisted. Someone had been paid off, and she needed to find out who. She started making a mental list of people who had access to this case from the beginning. Marcus Reed, the first person she had turned to for help. He had fought battles like this before and lost too many of them. He was tired, frustrated, but did that make him desperate? Could he have given up trying to win and started playing for the other side? Emily Carter. She was bold, willing to go after the truth, but the media had its own masters. Someone high up could have leaned on her. The pressure of losing everything might have been enough to make her fold. Then there was the jury. It wasn't just Whitmore controlling them. Someone on the inside was influencing how this played out, and that meant someone had direct access to their decisions. She scrolled through the files again, searching for anything connecting the payments to a name. And then, there it was. A document buried deep in the folder, flagged with a digital signature. A court official had authorized the suppression of key evidence. Charlotte inhaled sharply. The name on the approval line made her blood run cold. Marcus Reed. She gripped the edges of the laptop, her breath unsteady. It didn't make sense. Marcus had been on her side since the beginning. He had helped her dig through files, guided her through legal loopholes. Had it all been an act? Or was there something she didn't see? She didn't have time to process it before her phone vibrated against the table. An unknown number. She hesitated for only a second before answering. The voice on the other end was calm, deliberate. "You're closer than you think, Mrs. Hale." Charlotte's pulse slowed, her grip on the phone tightening. "But if you don't stop now, it won't just be you who pays the price." The voice paused, then added, "Your brother is still breathing. For now." The call disconnected. Charlotte stared at the screen, her fingers shaking. They weren't just warning her anymore. They were making it personal. Charlotte sat in her car outside the courthouse, gripping the steering wheel as she watched reporters swarm the steps of the Grand Stone Building. The media circus had already begun, cameras flashing, journalists shouting questions at anyone who passed. Whitmore was controlling the narrative, branding her as a desperate woman clinging to conspiracy theories. She wasn't going to let him win. The USB drive from the informant sat in her lap. Inside, it held everything: the erased case files, the altered testimonies, the proof of a system rigged to bury people like Jamal. But information alone wasn't enough. She needed leverage. She pulled out her phone and dialed. A gruff voice answered. "This better be good." "I need a meeting," Charlotte said. "Somewhere secure." There was a pause, then 30 minutes. No tails. The line went dead. Charlotte exhaled and started the car. She was about to turn the system against itself. 30 minutes later, she sat across from Senator David Langford, a man who had built his career on calling out corruption in the justice system. His office was dimly lit, the thick mahogany desk between them covered in stacks of reports and legislative drafts. Langford steepled his fingers. "You realize what you're asking for." Charlotte slid the USB drive across the table. "I'm asking for a chance to stop this before another name gets added to that list." Langford picked up the drive, turning it over between his fingers. "If this is as big as you say it won't just take down Callaway and Whitmore. You'll be going after people with real power." Charlotte's expression remained firm. "Then let's find out how much power they really have." Langford studied her for a long moment. Then he inserted the drive into his laptop. While the senator examined the files, Emily Carter was fighting a different battle. Her article had gone live, detailing the web of corruption between Callaway, Whitmore, and law enforcement. The public reaction was immediate, but so was the response from the machine they were up against. The larger media networks dismissed her report, calling it sensationalized journalism. A talking head on a major news channel accused her of manufacturing a scandal. It was a well-practiced tactic: discredit the messenger, drown out the truth. Charlotte watched the coverage from her phone as she walked up the courthouse steps, pushing through the reporters. Inside, the tension was thick. Whitmore stood in the hallway, speaking to a cluster of press members, his suit impeccable, his smirk just condescending enough. "Mrs. Hale is grasping at straws," he said smoothly. "This is what happens when desperation clouds judgment. The justice system doesn't operate on conspiracy theories." Charlotte didn't hesitate. She walked straight toward him, her voice cutting through the noise. "The justice system," she said, "is that what you call it? A system where evidence disappears and witnesses end up dead?" Whitmore turned to face her, the cameras now locked on their confrontation. He tilted his head, amusement flickering in his eyes. "And what exactly do you think you're going to do about it?" Charlotte stepped closer. "I'm going to expose you." Whitmore chuckled, shaking his head. "You can leak all the files you want. The people who matter, the ones in power, don't care about your sob story. Do you really think this city, this country, runs on truth?" Charlotte didn't blink. Whitmore leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You still don't get it, do you?" He smirked. "It's not about who's right. It's about who has control." Charlotte took a steady breath, then smiled. "Then let's see who's in control when this hits the Senate floor." For the first time, Whitmore's confidence faltered. It was slight, a brief flicker of doubt, but Charlotte saw it. She turned and walked away. This fight wasn't just in the courtroom anymore. It was in the public eye, in the halls of government, in the pressure that could be applied from every angle. She was playing a bigger game now, and she had just made her move. That night, Charlotte sat alone in her apartment, exhaustion weighing on her. The fight was far from over, but she felt momentum shifting. Then her phone buzzed. An anonymous email. She hesitated before opening it. A single attachment. A scanned document. Charlotte clicked it open, her breath catching as she read the words. It was a bank transfer record, a direct payment made to someone involved in the case. She scrolled down, her heart pounding. The recipient's name was someone she knew, someone she trusted. She stared at the name, her mind reeling. One of her allies had been working for the enemy all along. Charlotte stared at the name on the document, her stomach twisting into knots. Marcus Reed. She had trusted him. He had been with her from the beginning, guiding her through the legal maze, offering advice, standing by her side as they fought against a system built to crush people like Jamal. And yet, there it was. His name, linked to a series of payments from an anonymous fund that led back to Whitmore's office. Her chest felt tight, a mix of fury and disbelief clawing at her throat. She needed answers. Now Marcus was in his office when she arrived, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, as if he were just another overworked attorney trying to keep up with an endless caseload. Papers were scattered across his desk, but as soon as he saw her, his expression shifted, something between surprise and caution. "Charlotte," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I didn't expect you tonight." She closed the door behind her, locking it with deliberate slowness. "Yeah," she said, voice steady. I wasn't expecting to be here either. But then I got this. She tossed the document onto his desk. Marcus glanced at it, his face unreadable. Then with a slow exhale, he leaned forward, skimming the contents. When he finally looked up, there was no denial in his eyes. He didn't even try. "So," he murmured, "you finally figured it out." Charlotte clenched her fists. "How long?" Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "That depends. How long have I known the system was rigged?" "Years. How long have I known there was no winning against it?" "Even longer." Her jaw tightened. "And how long have you been working with Whitmore?" That made him flinch. He leaned back, studying her like he was deciding how much to say. "Charlotte, do you really think this fight was ever fair? Look at me. How many cases have I lost? How many innocent people have I watched get sentenced because the judge made up his mind before the trial even started?" "So that's your excuse," she shot back. "You decided if you couldn't win, you'd just play for the other team?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "I decided I wasn't going to spend my entire career being the guy who loses every time. Whitmore made me an offer. He didn't ask me to plant evidence or frame anyone. Just look the other way. Let things take their course." "Jamal is your client," Charlotte hissed. "You were supposed to defend him?" Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "Defend him? Against what? Against a judge who had already decided the verdict? Against a prosecutor with the entire system in his pocket? I did what I had to do to survive." Charlotte's nails dug into her palm. "So that's what you are now? A man who survives by selling out people who trust him?" Something flickered across Marcus's face. Regret, shame, maybe even guilt. But it wasn't enough. Charlotte took a slow breath, forcing herself to calm down. She still needed him. Marcus had been inside Whitmore's circle. If she played this right, she could turn his betrayal into an advantage. "Tell me everything," she said, voice quieter now. "Every deal you made, every move Whitmore has planned." Marcus hesitated. "And if I don't?" Charlotte gave him a cold smile. "Then I make sure every judge, every journalist, and every activist in this city knows exactly who you are. You think working for Whitmore is bad? Wait until the entire legal community sees you as the guy who sold out his own people." Marcus exhaled, rubbing his temple. Then finally he nodded. For the next hour, Marcus talked. He told her how Whitmore had been working behind the scenes to manipulate the trial, how Calloway had been tipped off in advance about which evidence to suppress, how the jury had been handpicked to include at least 3 people with known biases against defendants like Jamal. He told her about the real power, people outside of Whitmore and Calloway, people pulling the strings from even higher up. And then he gave her what she really needed, a paper trail, financial transactions, phone records, emails, proof. Whitmore and Calloway weren't just corrupt, they were part of something bigger. Charlotte felt her heart pounding as she scanned the documents Marcus had just handed her. This wasn't just enough to expose them. This was enough to end them. But she couldn't do it alone. She picked up her phone and dialed. It rang twice before a voice answered. "Senator Langford speaking." Charlotte gripped the papers tighter. "I have something for you, but I need you to go public, now." There was a pause, then Langford said, "Where do we meet?" Charlotte's jaw tightened. "It has to be somewhere safe. They know I'm coming." Langford's voice was firm. "Then let's make sure they know we're ready." Charlotte walked into the courtroom with her head high, gripping the folder in her hand like a weapon. The room was packed. Reporters, activists, law students, and concerned citizens filled the benches, whispering among themselves as the tension hung heavy in the air. The public had finally turned its attention to Jamal's case. The bailiff called for order as Judge Calloway took his seat, his expression tight. He knew what was coming. He just didn't know how hard it would hit. Across the aisle, Whitmore adjusted his tie, his confidence still intact but his eyes sharper now, scanning the room, looking for a way to get ahead of whatever Charlotte was about to pull. Jamal sat quietly at the defendant's table, his face bruised but his gaze steady. He wasn't the same man who had been dragged into this courtroom weeks ago. He was stronger now, knowing his sister was fighting like hell to make sure he walked out of here a free man. The moment had come. Charlotte stood. "Your Honor," she began, voice steady but strong. I am submitting new evidence that directly impacts the legitimacy of this case. This evidence proves beyond a doubt that my client's arrest was not only unjustified, but part of a broader pattern of misconduct and corruption within the justice system. Calloway's grip on his gavel tightened. Mrs. Hale, you were already informed that the deadline for new evidence had passed. Charlotte stepped forward, unwavering. And yet, I have proof that the evidence previously submitted by the prosecution was manipulated. That changes everything. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Whitmore stood, his voice calm but sharp. Your Honor, this is absurd. Mrs. Hale has been on a witch hunt, attempting to smear the credibility of this court in this trial. I move to strike this nonsense from the record. Charlotte didn't even turn to look at him. Instead, she raised the folder. Inside were the documents, the transaction records, the court memos Whitmore never wanted to see the light of day. And most importantly, there was something no one had expected, a video. She glanced at the bailiff. I request permission to play a key piece of evidence. Calloway hesitated. Whitmore straightened. Absolutely not. But it was too late. The screen in the courtroom flickered to life. The sound was grainy, but the voices were clear. Marcus Reed sat in a dimly lit office, his hands clasped together. His voice was low but unmistakable. They rigged it from the start. The prosecution had the jury picked before the trial even began. Evidence was suppressed, and Calloway made sure any motion from the defense was blocked before it could get traction. The room went silent. The footage continued. I was told to stall, to pretend to fight but never actually win. Whitmore made it clear. If I did what I was told, my career would go places. If I didn't, well, we've seen what happens to people who push too hard. Marcus's confession landed like a hammer blow. Calloway paled. Whitmore clenched his jaw, but even he knew there was no walking away from this untouched. Charlotte turned to the judge. Your Honor, I am requesting an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client on the basis of prosecutorial misconduct, judicial bias, and the suppression of exculpatory evidence. Before Calloway could respond, Whitmore slammed his hand against the table. Your Honor, this is nothing but a desperate attempt to derail these proceedings. That video is inadmissible. It's a confession, Charlotte cut him off, from my client's own defense attorney. And if this court refuses to acknowledge it, then I have no doubt that the Department of Justice will. A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Whitmore's confidence cracked. Calloway's hands trembled slightly as he looked over at the jury. They weren't just uncertain anymore. They were angry. Charlotte leaned in slightly, her voice a quiet but deadly challenge. Your Honor, if you refuse to allow this evidence, you won't just be ignoring the truth. You'll be proving to this entire courtroom that you are part of the corruption I just exposed. Calloway swallowed. He was trapped. He knew it. The judge cleared his throat, avoiding Whitmore's burning stare. This court will recess while I review the motion. The gavel slammed down, but it didn't matter, because outside a storm was already brewing. The second Charlotte stepped outside the courthouse, she knew things had changed. A crowd had gathered, hundreds of people filling the steps and sidewalks, holding signs, chanting Jamal's name, demanding justice. Media vans lined the street, cameras rolling as journalists updated the world in real time. The system had tried to bury this case, but now the world was watching. The courtroom was drowning in tension. The air was thick with anticipation, every pair of eyes locked on Judge Calloway as he sat frozen at his bench. His fingers tapped restlessly against the wood, his mind racing between two impossible choices. If he allowed Charlotte's evidence, his career, his alliances, and everything he had built would collapse in an instant. He would no longer be a man of power, but a symbol of disgrace. But if he rejected it, if he attempted to bury this like he had done so many times before, he knew he would be met with a storm unlike any other. The public was watching now. The media, the activists, the politicians, everyone. There was no easy way out. Across the room, Whitmore sat rigid, gripping the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wasn't used to being on the defensive. His entire career had been built on bending the system to his will, on silencing those who thought they could challenge him. Now he was the one being cornered. He cleared his throat, rising from his seat. Your Honor, Given the nature of these last-minute allegations, I request an immediate adjournment until we can properly review. Charlotte stood before he could finish. That's not going to happen, she said firmly, her voice carrying through the courtroom. Calloway shot her a sharp look. Mrs. Hale, you are out of order. So is this entire trial, she fired back. For weeks, we have watched as evidence was suppressed, as motions were denied, as my client was treated as guilty before he even had a chance to defend himself. And now that the truth is out, now that the corruption is undeniable, the prosecution wants to delay? Whitmore glared at her, but she didn't back down. No more waiting, Charlotte continued. No more loopholes, no more technicalities. We deserve an answer today. The courtroom stirred. The jury whispered among themselves, some nodding in agreement. Even Calloway shifted in his seat, beads of sweat forming at his brow. Whitmore's jaw tightened. Your Honor, I must... Before he could finish, the doors of the courtroom burst open. A flood of federal agents stormed in, their badges flashing, their presence a sudden, undeniable force. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The reporters scrambled, cameras clicking in a frenzy as armed officers moved in with unwavering precision. One agent stepped forward, holding up a document. Judge Richard Calloway, Prosecutor Jonathan Whitmore, by order of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, you are both under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and abuse of power. Calloway's face drained of color. Whitmore shot up from his chair. This is outrageous. Two agents grabbed him by the arms, pulling him back as he struggled. You don't know what you're doing, he shouted. This is a mistake. Charlotte stood in stunned silence. She hadn't arranged this. She had fought for justice, yes, but she hadn't expected this. Then her phone buzzed. A single message from an unknown number. You played your part. Now we're playing ours. She exhaled sharply, suddenly realizing who had pulled the strings. Senator Langford. She glanced toward the back of the courtroom, just in time to see him standing near the exit, hands folded, a knowing look in his eyes. He had gone directly to the Department of Justice. He had called in the cavalry before Charlotte even knew it was an option. She wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or unsettled. This wasn't just a victory for her. This was a political move. She turned back to the front of the room. Calloway, his career officially in ruins, slumped in his chair as two officers read him his rights. The arrogance, the confidence, all of it had drained from his face. Whitmore, on the other hand, was still fighting. As they led him past Charlotte, he twisted his head toward her, his eyes burning with rage. You think this is over? He hissed. You have no idea what you've started. She didn't flinch. No, Whitmore, she said quietly. You have no idea what's coming. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind him. The trial was over. And then, Judge Calloway's voice cracked through the tension. In light of these developments, he said, each word laced with reluctant finality, the court has no choice but to declare a mistrial. All charges against the defendant, Jamal Hale, are dismissed. A beat of silence. Then the courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed to the phones. Cameras flashed. Voices rose in a deafening wave of reactions. Charlotte turned to Jamal, who was still frozen in his seat. You're free, she whispered. His eyes widened as if the words hadn't fully processed yet. She reached out, grabbing his hand. You're free. A slow smile broke across his bruised face. He let out a breath that he had been holding for too long. The weight was gone. Charlotte pulled him into a tight embrace, ignoring the chaos around them. The battle had been brutal. But in the end, they had won. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers. The news had already spread. Activists, community leaders, and everyday people stood together, their signs raised high, their voices demanding more. This wasn't just about Jamal. This was about every person like him. Charlotte stood at the top of the courthouse steps, her brother beside her, looking out at the people who had fought alongside them. This was a victory, but deep down, she knew the system was still standing, and it wasn't going down without a fight. The courthouse steps were a sea of movement, reporters shouting into cameras, protesters cheering, cameras flashing in an endless stream of light. The energy in the air was electric, a rare moment where justice had seemed to prevail. As Whitmore and Calloway were led out in handcuffs, the crowd roared. Some people chanted Jamal's name. Others held up signs calling for deeper investigations. For a moment, it felt like victory. Charlotte stood at the edge of it all, Jamal beside her. His hand rested on her shoulder, steady, grateful. He was free, but she could see it in his eyes. He knew the fight wasn't over either. "You did it," he murmured. Charlotte let out a slow breath. "We did it." But even as she said the words, something inside her refused to settle. Yes, Whitmore and Calloway were finished, but they weren't the real architects of this machine. They were just pawns. And the people who truly controlled this system were still out there, untouched, watching. Inside the courthouse, Senator Langford approached her, slipping through the chaos with a composed smile. "Well done, Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice calm but measured. "That was one hell of a fight." Charlotte studied him. "You knew the feds were coming, didn't you?" Langford didn't deny it. "Let's just say, I gave them a little push in the right direction." She narrowed her eyes. "And why would you do that?" Langford smiled, but there was something unreadable in his expression. "Because you were right. This isn't just about one case. It's about an entire system. And now that the world is watching, we have an opportunity to change it." Charlotte crossed her arms. "And let me guess, you want me involved?" Langford nodded. "We're forming a special commission on judicial reform. We need people who understand how deep the rot goes. People who won't back down when things get ugly." Charlotte glanced at Jamal, then back at the senator. "And what happens when I start digging into the people who really run this machine?" Langford's expression didn't change. "Then you'll finally see how far they're willing to go to stop you." She let his words settle, the weight of them pressing against her chest. She had spent so much time trying to get one man out of this system. Now she had a chance to dismantle the system itself. But at what cost? That night, Charlotte sat alone in her apartment, the echoes of the day still lingering. The city outside her window felt different. Not safer, not cleaner. Just exposed. Her phone buzzed. She reached for it, expecting Langford, maybe Emily. Instead, it was an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. A voice, calm and deliberate, came through the line. "You think you've won?" Charlotte felt her grip tighten around the phone. "This was never about Whitmore and Calloway," the voice continued. "You barely scratched the surface. And now, you've made enemies you can't even begin to understand." Charlotte's pulse remained steady. She refused to give them the satisfaction of fear. "Good," she said. "Then let's see who blinks first." There was silence. Then, the line went dead. Justice is rarely about one courtroom battle. It's about the forces that shape those battles, the power behind the scenes, the deals made in secret, the systems built to protect the few at the expense of the many. Charlotte fought for her brother, but in doing so, she uncovered a truth much larger than one case. The system isn't broken. It was built this way. So the question remains, if those in power will do anything to keep it that way, how far are we willing to go to change it? What would you do in Charlotte's position? Would you walk away, knowing you had won one fight? Or would you stay, knowing the war had just begun? Let us know in the comments. And if you don't want to miss what happens next, don't forget to subscribe. There's always another story waiting to be told.